An Israeli airstrike on a school in Gaza kills 6 people working for the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees. UNRWA has repeatedly been attacked by Israel during its war. So why is the agency so important to Palestinians, and why does Israel want to destroy it? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. Israel has killed 18 people when it attacked a school in Gaza. It's the 5th time they've targeted this same school that has been sheltering 12,000 Palestinians left homeless or forced to flee bombardment. Among the dead, 6 staff members of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, or UNRWA. That's the most the organisation's lost in a single incident in the war. Attacking schools and places of shelter is a war crime. For UNRWA, coming under Israeli attack is nothing new. Around 220 workers have been killed since October. But for years, the agency has come under sustained political attack too. UNRWA staff have been killed and its work is frequently obstructed. Hostility has intensified under Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who's repeatedly called for it to be abolished. So why is Israel targeting UNRWA, and why is the organisation so important to Palestinians? We'll discuss all of this with our panel of guests in a moment. But first, this report from Laura Khan.
Decorated blankets now serve to carry the dead. Among them, 6 members of staff working for the UN Refugee Agency, UNRWA, the highest number killed in a single incident in the war. They were supporting displaced people in a UN shelter in the Nusayrat refugee camp.
All my children, 6 of them were killed. 6 children, including a baby twin. What crime, what wrong did these innocent children do?
All of a sudden, there was a huge explosion. This section of the school is dedicated only to women. Women and children were blown to pieces.
Survivors have been rushed to the local hospital, but with hardly any resources left. Many people are in shock on the floor as doctors assess their needs. In a statement on X, UNRWA says the school has been hit 5 times since the war began, and it's home to around 12,000 displaced people, mainly women and children. Crushed bodies pulled from concrete and twisted metal. UNRWA says at a time where its work is most needed to support vulnerable people, Israel has been attempting to dismantle the agency. They say it's been obstructing its work and lobbying against it in the US for many years. Israel's accusations of staff of the agency being involved in the October 7th attacks have been rejected by a UN investigation, apart from a finding that 9 may have had some involvement. Most nations that cut funding after Israel's claims have resumed donations, but UNRWA remains underfunded, and during Israel's war, at least 220 of its staff have been killed.
The United Nations provides the Israelis with GPS data on where every location, all of our locations, and in fact, to dispel another rumor, the UN just doesn't get up in the morning and decide to drive somewhere in Gaza. Every one of those movements is coordinated with the Israeli Defense Force.
The latest attack had received widespread international condemnation. The United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres said on X, "What's happening in Gaza is totally unacceptable." Guterres was criticised by Israel's ambassador to the UN, Danny Danon, who said Israel will continue its attacks in what he called a just war. Despite accusations of widespread war crimes and breaches of international law, Israel is continuing its relentless war as the world watches on, and more Palestinian civilians, UN staff, aid workers and activists are killed. Laura Khan for Inside Story, Al Jazeera.
Well, let's meet our panel who are going to discuss this with us further. In Bethlehem, in the occupied West Bank, we have Riham Jafari, Communication and Advocacy Coordinator at ActionAid Palestine and a former staff member of UNRWA. In London, Chris Gunness, a former spokesman for UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency that supports Palestinian refugees. And in Cairo, Tamara Al-Rifai, current spokesman for UNRWA. Thank you and a warm welcome to all of you. I'm going to bring two of you in a little later, but Tamara, I want to focus with you first on the details of this attack. So tell us exactly what happened.
This attack was another one in a long series of attacks on UNRWA premises since the beginning of the war, in total disregard for international humanitarian law, which stipulates that humanitarian civilian infrastructure must be protected at all times. The Israeli airstrikes on the school yesterday in Nusayrat left scores of people killed, but these people include 6 of my own colleagues at UNRWA, bringing the death toll amongst UNRWA staff to a staggering 220 UNRWA staff colleagues of mine killed. Now, this particular school turned shelter, like most of our UNRWA schools in Gaza, was hosting 12,000 people who had been, for most, repeatedly displaced following the mass displacement, the recurrent mass displacement of Gaza since the beginning of the war. And to add a layer of drama to the incident, it was a school that UNRWA was using to administer the polio vaccination campaign. So not only was it a school before this conflict, turned into a shelter during this conflict, but it was also used for this emergency vaccination campaign to curb the spread of polio virus.
And Tamara, just to be clear, there was an agreement, was there not, between the United Nations and Israel that the polio vaccination could take place and none of the premises would be targeted. It's also shocking to me that this same school converted into a shelter had been hit. This was the 5th time.
Most of our premises were hit more than once. So there seems to be a pattern of hitting a premise and then returning to it. But to your point, remember, the UN coined the term polio poses just to describe that agreement with the government of Israel of allowing a few hours of respite every day and neutralizing certain premises specifically to be able to vaccinate around 640,000 kids. In addition to that, we do share, I just heard my colleague Bill earlier in this program, we do share the GPS of all our locations every day with the government of Israel. So it is not possible to say we did not know this was a UN school.
So you gave the coordinates, what's called deconfliction, to Israel, and yet they clearly knew the coordinates because they'd already hit it 4 times before. Now, Israel says they were targeting Hamas. Let me read part of what they said. A conducted precise strike on terrorists who were operating inside a Hamas command and control centre. They also claim they took numerous steps to mitigate the risk of harming civilians using precision weapons, aerial surveillance and additional intelligence. What do you make of that Israeli statement? And they say Hamas were there. You have staff who were there, 6 of whom died. Did any of your people at any stage see Hamas in that school/shelter?
What I can say is that even during military operations, there are principles of the conduct of hostilities that have to apply at all times. And one of them is the principle of proportionality, and the other is the principle of distinction. You've asked us not to use too much specialized language, but in essence, that means that any hit, any strike by any of the warring parties has to be really calibrated against the damage it will cause. And therefore, there is always that tension between military experts and jurists, humanitarian law people, whereby military experts say, well, a little bit of risk-taking for the sake of a military objective is fine. And the human rights and humanitarian law people, my community, always respond that nothing is worth losing one civilian life. And therefore, for us, having had over 160 of our clearly marked UN premises hit, with displaced people inside them, people who sought the protection of the blue flag and then felt that we did not give them that protection.
Well, Tamara, you are the current spokesman for UNRWA, and that means you're somewhat constrained working for the United Nations in what you can say. Chris, used to have that role. He doesn't have any constraints at all. So I can ask you this question, which perhaps Tamara can't answer, Chris. How do you feel about the way Israel's acted?
This slaughter of UNRWA workers in a UN-designated school where there were 12,000 refugees and displaced people, which has been used for a polio vaccination centre as part of an international programme to inoculate over 600,000 children against polio, is an abomination. It's an absolute stain on the conscience of humanity, and it must be condemned in the strongest possible terms, because not only must there be condemnation, there must be an investigation for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and indeed genocide. Now, the good news is that those are already going on. The International Criminal Court has an ongoing investigation against Benjamin Netanyahu and his defense minister, Yoav Gallant, and indeed Hamas. And if there were Hamas fighters in that school, then clearly that must be investigated. The ICC has said that it wants to issue an arrest warrant for Mr. Netanyahu, and I hope that that goes through, because clearly this must be thoroughly investigated. Meanwhile, at the International Court of Justice, South Africa has brought a case for genocide, and indeed attacks on children are specifically outlined by the Genocide Convention. And here we have an attack which has been made against a polio vaccination centre in a UN-designated school. So I hope that there is an investigation, and I hope that those on the ground can collect evidence, that there will be communications with both the ICJ and the ICC investigators, and this will become part of a case against those who are responsible, whichever side of the conflict they are on. And I hope those people, including Mr. Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, are held to the highest possible standards of international justice and accountability.
Riham in Bethlehem, as Chris says here, the law is completely clear. I think it's interesting that in the past the UN Secretary General has left it to legal bodies to say whether something was a war crime or not. In his very strong statement, he says these dramatic violations of international humanitarian law need to stop now. The Secretary General effectively saying it's a war crime too.
I agree with what is mentioned, and so the continuous attack against UNRWA schools and shelters is another failure and additional or a continuous failure for the international community and the world governments to force Israel to adhere to the international law. And it is also an indicators for the impunity that Israel enjoys. And this is not the first school that it is targeted by Israel, and it will not be the last one unless the international law is enforced. This crisis in Gaza and these war crimes are continued every day and every moment under the rule of impunity, under the lack of international pressure and real pressures on Israeli government to adhere at least to international law, and also under the failure of the international community and the influential governments on Israeli government to reach a ceasefire. These acts will be continued. More war crimes will be committed, and who will be the victims? They will be the children and the women. So the condemnation and the statements and all the mobilization that are being conducted and taken around the world are not translated into real actions that could put an end to this crisis.
Chris, just bring you back in on international law, because Tamara's boss, the Commissioner General of UNRWA, Philippe Lazzarini, he's been quoted as saying, the longer impunity prevails, the more international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions will become irrelevant. I mean, is there a bigger issue here that no one's going to care about international law if Israel continues to get away with this?
I think Commissioner General Lazzarini is 100% correct. What we're seeing is the need for the application of international humanitarian law, but for the impunity to grow. The gap between the need for justice and the denial of justice is getting ever larger. And to be clear, Gaza is a litmus test. The treatment of the Palestinian people right now is a litmus test for the UN's commitment to security and peace and to the rule of law. And what we're seeing is the credibility of the UN eroded with every attack we're seeing. And can I also say that beyond the UN, there are the member states. Now, the US is now completely obsessed with the presidential election, but where are the Europeans? Where are the powerful European member states? Where are the Scandinavians, for example? Where are the British? You know, these are the big donors to UNRWA. They should be speaking out. I see that the Irish Premier has issued a strong statement. The international donor community, which supports UNRWA, not enough in my view, should be speaking out, making these political points about Israel being held to account. Now, to be clear, we are hoping that next Wednesday in the UN General Assembly in New York, there will be a very powerful resolution which calls for a complete or a near complete arms embargo, though there are aspects of that which could be strengthened, a trade embargo, a call for the end of occupation. At the moment, the draft says within 12 months. And let's be clear, the blockade of Gaza, one of the worst blockades we've seen in human history, up there with Leningrad, the Warsaw Ghetto. It's a stain, as I say, on the conscience of humanity. This resolution is calling for that to end. Now, these member states have an historic opportunity to support that resolution and to ensure that this appalling blockade ends. And the latest UNRWA sitrep says that just 70 trucks a day were allowed by the Israeli authorities into Gaza in the month of August. UNRWA says that OCHA, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, says, according to the latest UNRWA sitrep, that the number of denials of aid trucks into Gaza has doubled in August. So let's give this some context. One of the worst blockades in human history. We've seen some polio vaccinations, but let's be clear, nearly 20,000 children have been killed. You know, great, let's have a polio vaccination program. Clearly, children must be protected against polio. But the world has stood by as nearly 20,000 children have been killed. I would like to use the word slaughter, because frankly, animals are slaughtered in more humane conditions than the children of Gaza. The women and children and civilians are being slaughtered at the moment by the Israeli army.
Yeah, Chris, you mentioned some of those countries. There were some statements, France condemning this latest attack in the strongest terms, Germany saying totally unacceptable, the UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy appalling, and the EU High Representative for Foreign Policy Joseph Borrell outraged. But it's words, not action. Tamara, this is not, I mean, just look in the last few days. If you can tell us about the other, I mean, there have been every day's incidents in Gaza, but Israel dropped 2,000-pound bombs on a tented encampment, a place that it told people to go to, that it said was a safe zone.
There is nowhere safe in Gaza. And so the claim that people could find safety somewhere and leave an area to military operations is a false claim. What we've seen in Gaza is that 1.9 million Gazans, that is over 90% of the entire population, have been forcibly displaced repeatedly since the beginning of the conflict. And every time they go somewhere, because they receive the so-called evacuation notices, which in reality are forced displacement notices, they leave with whatever they can take with them, and it's always less than what they had before, whether it's possessions or even family members. They leave with whatever they have left, they go somewhere, and that new somewhere is not safe. And therefore, we've repeatedly said nowhere is safe in Gaza, and only a ceasefire would allow for a true aid response, humanitarian response, to be rolled out. Now, UNRWA is the largest humanitarian organization involved in the largest humanitarian response, if only by managing our shelters and distributing food, mattresses, clean drinking water, and now the polio campaign. But in reality, even that humanitarian response is a drop in an ocean of needs of Gazans. It's almost been a year of relentless fighting and non-stop forced evacuations, forced displacement. People have lost everything from family members to homes to education for most of Gaza's children for the last 2 years. And also those who haven't been killed but have been injured, for most of them, it'll take years for them to for their injuries to heal, let alone their psychological trauma.
Riham, it's also worth, as we look at what's happened just in the last few days, there was an appalling incident involving the UN and the UN's own staff in a convoy, part of the polio operation, who were stopped, they were questioned, they were threatened with weapons drawn against them, live shots were fired, their vehicles were damaged by bulldozers. I mean, Israel seems to be deliberately targeting the UN. Would you agree, Riham?
Yes, it is. It appears that Israel continued to target not UN, and it also targets all humanitarian organizations working in Gaza with different tools. When it hinders the delivery of a humanitarian aid, when it restricts the number of aid trucks entering to Gaza, when attacks the offices of humanitarian organizations, the non-stop evacuation orders which impede the delivery of a humanitarian response, when attacks and kill the humanitarian aid workers, like with what happened with UNRWA staff and with the staff of World Central Kitchen, and also when restricts and limit the amount of fuel needed for Gaza. There are many conditions that are created on the ground, make the work of a humanitarian workers and the aid workers on the ground more difficult and sometimes impossible. And when Israel impedes the entrance of huge and necessary equipment needed to remove the rebels and to enable the construction and the maintenance workers to remove the rebel and to facilitate the walk and the work of aid trucks, these contribute to difficulties that Israel tried to
Okay, Riham, I'd like to briefly at the end take our conversation beyond Gaza and look at the totality of UNRWA's work, because UNRWA, the UN agency for Palestinian refugees, supports nearly 6 million Palestinian refugees across the Middle East, in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, the occupied West Bank, occupied East Jerusalem and Gaza. It also gives food and cash to more than 1.8 million Palestinians, most of them in Gaza. It employs about 13,000 staff. 220 of them have been killed in Israeli attacks since October the 7th. More than 100 UNRWA facilities have been destroyed during the war. Chris, the reason I'm taking the focus out from Gaza to the rest of UNRWA's work is because I want to understand whether that might be the political reason why Israel hates UNRWA so much. Would you agree?
100%. I mean, let's not forget that behind all these operational, financial attacks on UNRWA by the Israelis are the wider political implications. Of course, Israel is deluded if it thinks that by attacking UNRWA, it can get rid of 5.9 million refugees and their right of return. And that's indeed the issue that lies behind all of this. Israel believes, and it's been blocking the right of return. In fact, it's been denying wholesale the rights, all sorts of rights of the Palestinians. It believes that it can suddenly airbrush out of history 5.9 million people, their history, their identity, their rights, and indeed the organization mandated by the international community to look after them. That, of course, is a piece of Zionist fiction. It's a fantasy by men like Smotrich and other Israeli ministers. The fact is that the plight of the refugees and UNRWA itself will only hand over its services to a Palestinian government in the context of a lasting and just solution. And that includes the protection of all the rights of the Palestinians, including the right of return. How that right is implemented is up to the refugees concerned, and it's to be negotiated between the parties. But UNRWA will hand over its services in the context of a just and lasting solution of the refugee issue. No Israeli attack, no Israeli denial of visas, trying to close down UNRWA's bank accounts, trying to withhold the lease on its property in the West Bank. None of that will ever take away from the fact that these are human beings with inalienable rights, just as all Israelis have inalienable rights.
Tamara, when we look at the work your organisation is doing, 220 of your staff have been killed. I remember it was months ago, I think it was the end of last year, I sat down for an extended interview with your boss, the Commissioner General, and he said these were the darkest days for UNRWA. Well, they've certainly got much darker than that. How hard is it for you and the people you work with every day to keep going in these circumstances?
There are two forces that are almost opposite for me and for many of my colleagues. The first one is the immense feeling of responsibility over what is happening to our colleagues in Gaza, but also to the people of Gaza whom we serve. On the other hand, there is an immense feeling of gratitude for probably an unprecedented sense of solidarity with UNRWA globally. The kind of support we're getting, whether it's political support, even though for now many statements, while we wait for action, such as a commission of inquiry, for example, but we're also getting a lot of support financially from individuals, lay people, anyone, people who just write and say, hey, we want to donate to your organization because we see the impact of what you're doing in Gaza. As you mentioned, Jim, earlier, beyond Gaza, UNRWA is an entire regional establishment that provides public-like services, schools, basic healthcare, social protection to an entire community that is waiting to be recognized and part of a political solution so that one day they are no longer refugees. And that is at the center of the global solidarity that UNRWA is getting, that recognition that UNRWA represents a collective memory of an entire community, and that as long as their status is in limbo, their situation is in limbo, whether it's inside the occupied Palestinian territory or in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, then UNRWA is the UN agency that represents them. Most of the members of the General Assembly choose UNRWA every 3 years to continue supporting Palestine refugees. And that is what I call global recognition.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all three of you, our guests today, Riham Jafari, Chris Gunness and Tamara Al-Rifai. Al Jazeera's coverage of the war on Gaza continues around the clock, with our teams reporting on the ground and full analysis on aljazeera.com. We always want to hear from you too. Post your thoughts on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or we're also on X. Find us at AJ Inside Story. Next time, in just under 24 hours, I'll have a look at where the US election campaign stands. Until then, from me, James Bays, and the team here, bye-bye for now.